Critics didn't call her an amateur. They called her a disaster. Her voice was publicly described as flat, immature, and completely unacceptable. These weren't quiet whispers. They were brutal headlines broadcast for the world. Margaret Truman's opera dream didn't just fail. It was dissected by the national press and ridiculed as a farce. She stepped onto the stage as an artist and stepped off as a testament to her incompetence. The cruelest part was that her every off-key note was amplified by a single fact. She was the daughter of the President of the United States. The White House wasn't a protective shield, it was a giant magnifying glass, turning her personal humiliation into a national spectacle. But in the ultimate plot twist, the woman shamed for her voice would make a fortune writing best-selling mystery novels, selling millions of copies, and getting the last laugh. But that success was a long road. To see how the story really began, we have to go back to the starting line. She was born Mary Margaret Truman on February 17, 1924, in Independence, Missouri. This wasn't the glittering world of East Coast political dynasties like the Roosevelts or the Kennedys. Families who had marinated in wealth and power for generations. This was the heartland. Independence was a town of quiet streets, sturdy Victorian homes, and a palpable sense of history. It had been the starting point of the Oregon, Santa Fe, and California trails. It was a place where lineage mattered, but it was a lineage of pioneers and farmers, not politicians and bankers. Her parents, Harry S. Truman and Bess Wallace, were the embodiment of this modest, no-nonsense Midwestern landscape. Harry was a farmer, a former World War I artillery captain, and a failed haberdasher. His men's clothing store had gone bankrupt in the post-war recession, leaving him in debt for years. He was a man of the people because he was the people. His entry into politics came not through ambition, but through connections and circumstance. He was chosen by the infamous Pendergast political machine of Kansas City to run for a local judgeship. He was honest, but he was also pragmatic, navigating a world of political bosses and backroom deals that would later earn him suspicion from the Washington elite Bess Wallace Truman. By contrast, was from one of Independence's most respected families. She was a town aristocrat, and her marriage to Harry, the farmer with dirt under his nails and business debts to his name, was seen by some as a step down. Where Harry was gregarious, quick-tempered, and loved a game of poker, Bess was reserved, dignified, and intensely private. She loathed the scrutiny of public life, enduring it with a stoic resignation that bordered on disdain. Margaret was their only child, and from the beginning that status, the only one, defined her. She was the sole focus of their ambitions, their hopes, and their fierce, almost primal protection. For Bess, Margaret was her constant companion and confidant, the one person with whom she could be completely unguarded. For Harry, Margaret was, quite simply, the boss's boss, his baby. He doted on her, wrote to her constantly when he was away, and placed her on a pedestal from which she would never descend. This concentrated, unfiltered parental focus created a young woman who was at once supremely confident in her worth and acutely aware of the crushing weight of expectation. Her early life was a curious split screen, a geographic and social whiplash. Her father's political career, powered by the Pendergast machine, was rising. In 1934, he was elected to the U.S. Senate. This victory, which surprised many, cleaved Margaret's life in two. From September to January, she was a regular student at public school back in Independence. She was just Margaret, living the life she had always known, surrounded by friends and family who had known her for her entire life. But from January to May, she was whisked away to Washington, D.C., This was a different world entirely. She was enrolled in Gunston Hall, an exclusive private school for girls, where her classmates were the daughters of the nation's elite, diplomats, cabinet secretaries, and old money families. Imagine that annual transition. One moment, you are among friends who see you as you are. The next, you are in the nation's capital, a city of whispers, power, and quiet judgment, a senator's daughter, to be analyzed and assessed. This duality became her normal. She learned to navigate two worlds, to code switch between the plain-spoken authenticity of Missouri and the polished, careful etiquette of Washington. It was the first of many balancing acts she would have to perform, and it gifted her with a unique social fluency, an ability to be equally at home with farmers and foreign dignitaries. She was studious, if not brilliant, and after graduating from Gunston Hall, she enrolled at George Washington University, also in D.C. She was drawn to history and international relations, a fitting choice, as history was about to engulf her family in a way she could never have anticipated. The first tremor of her future came on a cold, overcast day in January 1944. The nation was in the depths of World War II. At just 19 years old, Margaret, the daughter of the relatively obscure senator from Missouri, was given a high-profile honor. She was to christen the brand-new 45,000-ton battleship, the USS Missouri. We can see the photographs, a young woman wrapped in a fur coat looking both thrilled and slightly terrified as she prepares to swing the champagne bottle against the warship's mighty bow. The ship, nicknamed Mighty Mo, was a symbol of America's industrial power, a behemoth built for a brutal global conflict. She was accompanied by two college friends, and the girls were so excited by the event and by the Broadway show they'd seen the night before that they reportedly fell fast asleep in their chairs during a fancy dessert at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel later that evening. It's a charming human detail, a glimpse of the teenager beneath the public persona. But it was also a profound piece of foreshadowing. She was christening a ship that would, just over a year later, host the official surrender of the Japanese Empire in Tokyo Bay, effectively ending the war. And by the time that surrender happened, the 19-year-old girl who christened it would be living in the White House. Her father, the man who had given the order to use the atomic bomb that precipitated the war's end, the true earthquake struck in the spring and summer of 1944. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, his health failing but his will unbroken, was running for an unprecedented fourth term. His current vice president, Henry Wallace, was seen as dangerously liberal and too eccentric by the party bosses. With FDR's mortality a secret but palpable concern, the choice of his running mate was, in effect, the choice of the next president. The Democratic National Convention in Chicago was a brutal, smoke-filled affair. The party bosses, led by figures like Robert Hannegan, wanted someone safe, someone moderate, someone from the heartland who wouldn't alienate the southern wing of the party. They settled on Harry S. Truman. Truman, however, did not want the job. He was happy in the Senate. He knew what the job entailed, and he knew his wife, Bess, would despise the national spotlight. When Hannegan and the others cornered him in a hotel room, he famously protested, "I don't want to be vice president." But FDR had made his choice. Truman, ever the loyal party man and soldier, eventually, reluctantly, accepted. Margaret would later recall that when her father was nominated, her mother Bess was so distraught at the thought of the national spotlight that she looked as if a ton of bricks had fallen on her. Bess Truman hated the scrutiny. Margaret, on the other hand, was different. She was 20 years old, ambitious, and she had a dream of her own. She wanted to be a singer. In 1944, she graduated with an Associate of Arts degree. Her father was now Vice President of the United States. She was one step closer to the inferno. The family had only 82 days in the vice presidency, a brief, surreal interlude. Then, the inevitable happened. On April 12, 1945, FDR was dead. Harry Truman had been rushed to the White House. When he arrived, Eleanor Roosevelt approached him, placed a hand on his shoulder, and said, "Harry, the president is dead." His famous stunned reply was, "Is there anything I can do for you?" She replied, "Is there anything we can do for you? For you are the one in trouble now." Later that evening, after being sworn in, Truman found his daughter. He held her in his arms. Margaret, at just 21 years old, was the new first daughter. Her father, the farmer from Missouri, was now the 33rd President of the United States, inheriting a world in flames, a war on two fronts, and the terrible secret knowledge of the atomic bomb. Her life as a private citizen was over, forever. The gilded cage had just snapped shut. The White House may have been a cage, but Margaret Truman was not a passive prisoner. She refused to be defined simply as the president's daughter. While her mother retreated from the spotlight, Margaret prepared to step directly into its glare, armed with a dream she had nurtured for years. She would not be a socialite, she would be an artist, and she would pursue this ambition on the most public stages in the world, a decision that would bring both triumph and her first great public trial. Margaret Truman did not intend to be a socialite when her family moved into the White House on April 12, 1945. She was 21 years old, and unlike her mother Bess, she was not dismayed by the spotlight. She saw it as an opportunity. She had a plan. Since she was 16, she had been taking classical voice lessons, training as a coloratura soprano. This was not a hobby, not a genteel pastime for a well-bred young woman. It was a serious driving passion. And now, with her father in the White House, she had the most prominent platform in the world. But that platform was a treacherous, double-edged sword. It could open any door, but it also meant that when she walked through it, the audience wasn't just there to hear a singer. They were there to gawk at, scrutinize, and judge the president's daughter. Her name guaranteed a sold-out hall, but it also guaranteed that her voice would be the second thing people noticed. After her lineage, every note she sang would be filtered through the lens of politics, every review a potential referendum on her father's administration. She was determined to be judged on her own merits, an almost impossible feat when your address is 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. To prove her seriousness, she sought out the best instruction. She didn't rely on local teachers. She began intensive training with Helen Traubel. This was a significant choice. Traubel was not just any singer. She was a reigning dramatic soprano at the Metropolitan Opera, a world-class Wagnerian powerhouse. For Traubel to take her on signaled that Margaret's ambition was credible. She worked tirelessly, fitting grueling practice sessions into the suffocating schedule of a first daughter. A life filled with official dinners, diplomatic receptions, and endless public appearances. Her professional debut was meticulously and cleverly planned. On March 16, 1947, she did not appear on a stage in Washington or New York. She did not give the critics a visual target. Instead, she sang on a nationwide radio broadcast with the Detroit Symphony Orchestra, conducted by Carl Kruger. The radio, she and her team hoped, would act as a blind. It would force the public and the critics to hear her voice without seeing her name. It was an attempt to get a fair, unadulterated hearing. The performance, which included operatic arias, was a success. The reviews were polite, even encouraging. The New York Times noted her pleasant voice and musical intelligence. It was the validation she needed. Buoyed by this, she stepped from the relative anonymity of the radio into the full glare of the public stage. Her first major outdoor appearance was at the Hollywood Bowl on August 23, 1947. Imagine that. You are 23 years old, and your first big gig is not a small recital hall, but the legendary Hollywood Bowl, in front of a paying audience of nearly 20,000 people. The pressure was immense. She was, by all accounts, nervous but poised. She wore a white gown and a gardenia in her hair. The reviews were, once again, generally kind. They praised her charm, her bravery, and her poise. The critique of her voice was almost secondary, but still positive. She had passed the test. She began a grueling concert tour, a life of travel, rehearsals, and performances, all conducted under the watchful eye of the Secret Service and the national press. In 1948, her burgeoning career was put on hold. She paused her dream to do her political duty. Her father was running for president in his own right, and he was the consummate underdog, trailing New York Governor Thomas Dewey by a seemingly insurmountable margin. The polls were so certain of his defeat that Life magazine had famously run a photo of Dewey with the caption, "The next President of the United States." Margaret joined her parents on the famous Whistle Stop campaign. This was a brutal 30,000-mile cross-country train tour where the president gave fiery, off-the-cuff speeches from the back platform of the railroad car. The Ferdinand Magellan Margaret's presence was a vital piece of political strategy. She stood at her father's side, smiling and waving, projecting an image of a wholesome, loyal, all-American family. She softened her father's image, humanizing the man who was making impossible decisions about the atomic age and the Cold War. Her presence was a stark contrast to the stiff, formal, and distant image of his opponent. When Harry Truman won in the greatest political upset in American history, Margaret shared in the triumph. She had done her duty. Now she returned to her dream, her status more secure than ever. In November 1949, she hit the pinnacle, Carnegie Hall in New York City. This was it, the dream of every classical musician. To headline at Carnegie Hall was to be certified as a legitimate artist. She performed a demanding program of classical and modern pieces. The critics were, once again, respectful. They acknowledged her hard work and her genuine, if not powerhouse, talent. She was a legitimate, touring, professional classical singer. She was a guest on Toast of the Town with Ed Sullivan, one of the biggest shows on television. She was, for a fleeting, shining moment, a star in her own right. And then came December 5th, 1950. The backdrop to this night is crucial. The United States was now deep in the Korean War, a brutal, bloody conflict that had cost thousands of American lives. President Truman's approval ratings had plummeted. He was under immense, crushing, relentless stress. Margaret was performing at Constitution Hall in Washington, D.C. It was a high-profile concert in her hometown, attended by the city's political and social elite. In the audience was Paul Hume, the respected and feared music critic for the Washington Post the next morning. His review was published. It was not just negative, it was a surgical, devastating, and humiliating takedown. Hume wrote, "Miss Truman is a unique American phenomenon with a pleasant voice of little size and fair quality. She is extremely attractive on the stage. Yet Miss Truman cannot sing very well. She is flat a good deal of the time, more so last night than at any time we have heard her in past years. She has not improved in the years we have heard her, and still cannot sing with anything approaching professional finish." It was brutal. The line, "she is not improved," was the most painful, as it dismissed her years of training with Helen Traubel, her tours, her work at Carnegie Hall. It painted her as a dilettante, an amateur who was wasting everyone's time. Back at the White House, President Harry S. Truman read the review. His daughter, the only child he had protected his entire life, the baby he doted on, had been publicly humiliated. The man who was juggling the Korean War, the threat of nuclear annihilation, and a hostile Congress, snapped. The President of the United States, the man leading the free world, sat down, took out a sheet of White House stationery, and, in a fit of pure, unadulterated paternal rage, hand-wrote a letter to Paul Hume. The letter, which Hume would later receive at his home, read, "Mr. Hume, I've just read your lousy review of Margaret's concert. I've come to the conclusion that you are an 8-ulcer man on 4-ulcer pay. It seems to me that you are a frustrated old man who wishes he could have been successful. When you write such poppycock as was in this morning's paper, it shows conclusively that you're off the beam and at least 4 ulcers. Too many. Someday I hope to meet you. When that happens, you'll need a new nose, a lot of beefsteak for black eyes, and perhaps a supporter below." The letter was signed HST. Hume, perhaps unsure if it was real, showed it to his editor. The Washington Post authenticated the handwriting. The story exploded. It was an international scandal. The President of the United States had threatened a music critic with physical violence. It was on the front page of newspapers around the globe. It was, depending on your view, either an appalling abuse of power and a sign of a thin-skinned, volatile leader, or it was the deeply human, loyal, and almost comically relatable act of a father defending his daughter. Give 'em hell, Harry had done it again, this time not to a political opponent, but to a music critic. Margaret, who was on tour when the news broke, was mortified. Her father's attempt to defend her honor had made her a global laughingstock. She was mobbed by reporters not to ask about her music, but to ask about the letter. She handled the situation with a grace and political savvy her father had utterly lacked. She famously said, "Mr. Hume is a very fine critic. He has a right to write as he pleases." She sent a copy of her statement to her parents, a subtle, dignified rebuke. But the damage was done. The Paul Hume incident became the defining moment of her singing career, an epitaph written while she was still performing. It didn't matter how well she sang after that. Every review, every performance was now filtered through the lens of that letter. Comedians had a field day. She was no longer Margaret Truman, the soprano. She was the girl whose father threatened to beat up her critic. The dream, which she had pursued with such discipline and against such odds, had been fatally wounded. It had been killed, not just by a bad review, but by her father's ferocious, public, and suffocating love. In January 1953, Harry Truman's presidency ended. Dwight D. Eisenhower was sworn in, and the Trumans, for the first time in nearly 2 decades, were private citizens. They packed their belongings, boarded a train, and famously drove themselves home from the Independence Station in their own car, a scene of almost comical normalcy after the imperial power they had wielded. For Bess, it was a profound relief. For Margaret, it was a crossroads. The career she had poured her heart into, her dream of the opera stage, had been irrevocably tarnished, not just by Paul Hume's review, but by the international scandal of her father's response. The momentum was gone. She was 28 years old, one of the most famous women in the world, and unemployed. If she couldn't be an opera star, she would be a media star. She had already laid the groundwork, having signed a contract with NBC in 1951, while still in the White House, acting as a talent consultant. Now, she leaned into it fully. It turned out she was a natural. She was poised, witty, intelligent, and, thanks to her unique upbringing, utterly unfazed by fame or power. What celebrity could possibly intimidate a woman who had grown up shaking hands with Winston Churchill and sparring with her own father over breakfast. She became a co-host on the NBC radio program Weekday, a new ambitious morning show that ran for 90 minutes. Her co-host was a young, intense, and ambitious journalist named Mike Wallace. Can you imagine that pairing? The folksy but sophisticated former first daughter, the very symbol of the Democratic establishment, sitting side by side with the man who would become the Grand Inquisitor of 60 Minutes. Their show was a precursor to modern morning television, a mix of news, cultural commentary, and celebrity interviews. Margaret was not just a sidekick, she held her own, conducting interviews and offering opinions. Her voice now used not for areas, but for broadcast. She became a darling of the new television age, a frequent and welcome guest on the era's biggest programs. She was a regular panelist on the wildly popular game show, What's My Line? Here, her charm and quick wit were on full display. The show's premise, a panel of celebrities trying to guess a contestant's occupation, was simple, but it relied on the personality of the panelists. Margaret was a hit, sitting alongside regulars like Dorothy Kilgallen and Bennett Cerf, exuding an accessible, down-to-earth glamour. She was no longer the president's daughter. She was Margaret, a television personality, but her most remarkable and historically significant television appearance came on May 27, 1955. She was asked to be a substitute host for the legendary Edward R. Murrow on his flagship CBS program, Person to Person. This was an incredible honor. Person to Person was the show where Murrow, sitting in his New York studio wreathed in cigarette smoke, would visit the homes of the rich and famous via a live remote link. It was the original celebrity home tour and a stamp of cultural importance. For her episode, Margaret Truman decided to interview two people no one had ever seen in this context: her own parents. It was a masterful, intimate, and historically priceless piece of television. Sitting in a New York studio, she interviewed Harry and Bess, who were back in their modest Victorian home at 219 North Delaware Street in Independence. This was a brilliant piece of image-making. The American public saw that the man who had commanded armies and unleashed the atomic bomb now lived in a comfortable, slightly cluttered middle-class house, not a palace. Margaret took the audience on a tour. She spoke with Vieta Garr, the Trumans' longtime maid, humanizing the household. She walked them through her father's new study where he was working on his memoirs. At one point, she coaxed her father, the former president, to sit at the piano. He played Paderewski's Minuet, a piece he had once played for the amusement of Joseph Stalin at the Potsdam Conference. Seeing the gruff Give 'em Hell Harry gently playing a classical piece was a revelation. In that interview, she was not just a daughter, she was a journalist. She asked him what he considered his toughest decision. He didn't hesitate. Korea. The decision to go into Korea was the most difficult. And she asked him how he hoped to be remembered. His answer was pure Truman, as the people's president. It was a brilliant piece of image-making and a tender family portrait, all rolled into one. She had taken the medium of television and used it to shape her family's legacy. She wasn't just a host, she was a daughter, a historian, and a producer. She was, in short, controlling her own narrative for the first time in her life. This second act was an unqualified success. She was a respected broadcaster and a beloved public personality, and it was during this time, as a successful independent woman in New York, that she finally secured her private life. In 1955, she met Clifton Daniel, the whip-smart, high-ranking assistant foreign news editor for the New York Times. He was 12 years her senior, a seasoned journalist who had been a correspondent in London, Moscow, and the Middle East. He was serious, accomplished, and, like her, he understood the world of pressure, public scrutiny, and deadlines. He was not a flashy celebrity or a political scion. He was a man of substance, a World War II veteran from North Carolina who had built his own formidable career. He was, in other words, her equal. Their courtship was a real one, conducted over dinners and quiet conversations, away from the White House fishbowl. They married on April 21st, 1956, at the Trinity Episcopal Church in Independence. It was the social event of the year, a frenzy of national press descending on the small Missouri town. But it was her wedding, on her terms. Her father, the former president, walked her down the aisle. It was a genuine partnership, a union of two people who understood the demands of the public eye. They had 4 sons in quick succession: Clifton Truman, William Wallace, Harrison Gates, and Thomas Washington. Margaret, who had lived her entire childhood in the spotlight, was determined to give her sons the privacy she had never known. They were raised largely outside of the public eye. Clifton Daniels' career flourished. He rose through the ranks of the New York Times and in 1964 became the managing editor, the second most powerful job at the most important newspaper in the world. They were a New York power couple, but a quiet, dignified one. Margaret settled into the role of a prominent journalist's wife, a mother, and a public figure who now sat on corporate and nonprofit boards. She had done it. She had a family, a successful career, and an identity of her own, separate from her father. In 1973, Clifton stepped down as managing editor and moved the family to Washington to serve as the Times D.C. bureau chief. For Margaret, it was a return to the city of her youth, the city of her family's greatest triumphs and trials. But she was not returning as the first daughter. She was returning as Mrs. Clifton Daniel, the wife of a journalistic powerhouse, and as Margaret Truman, a respected media figure in her own right. This return to Washington, combined with the death of her father in 1972, would set the stage for her third and final act. She had been a singer and a media star. But her most successful and most controversial career was yet to come. She had successfully navigated 2 public lives, one on the concert stage, the other in the broadcast studio. She had also at last found personal happiness and built a family of her own. But as she returned to Washington, and as her father's health declined, she found herself at the threshold of a new identity, not just a performer or a personality, but a historian and a guardian. The death of Harry Truman in 1972 was the catalyst, providing the subject that would define her most successful, most lucrative, and final public act. In 1956, while a newlywed and a burgeoning media star, Margaret had published her first book, an autobiography called Souvenir. It was a charming, light, and predictably discreet read, a collection of anecdotes from her White House years. It was successful, but it was the work of a young woman capitalizing on her fame. Her true literary career, her third act, would not begin for another 2 decades. This act was not born from a desire for fame. She already had that, but from a place of profound love, duty, and a keen understanding of her own unique place in history. The catalyst was the death of her father on December 26, 1972. Harry S. Truman, the man who had been the central defining force of her life, was gone. When he left office in 1953, his approval ratings had been in the gutter, scraping the 20s. He was seen by many as a failed president, the man who had lost China to communism, who had fired the popular General MacArthur, and who admired the nation in the bloody, inconclusive Korean War. But in the intervening years, a reassessment had begun. Historians started to view his tough, decisive leadership, the Truman Doctrine, the Marshall Plan, the Berlin Airlift, the integration of the armed forces, with new respect. This reassessment was happening in the shadow of the Vietnam War And just as Margaret put pen to paper, the Watergate scandal. As the nation watched the Nixon presidency crumble under the weight of paranoia, cynicism, and constitutional crisis, there was a sudden, desperate hunger for a leader who seemed, by contrast, a paragon of integrity. America was nostalgic for a president who, whatever his faults, was blunt, honest, and famously incorruptible. A man whose most famous motto was, "The buck stops here." Into this moment stepped Margaret. She was back in Washington, D.C., living there as her husband, Clifton Daniel, ran the New York Times bureau. She was surrounded by the mechanisms of power and history. She took it upon herself to write her father's story, not as a historian, but as the only person who had been there for every step of the journey. In 1973, just a year after his death, she published Harry S. Truman. It was not a fluffy, sentimental memoir. It was a deeply researched, warm, and massive biography that drew on her own diaries, her parents' private correspondence, and her unmatched personal access. It was an act of historical preservation and, in many ways, an act of political rehabilitation. She presented her father as she knew him, the farmer, the soldier, the loyal husband, the doting father, the man who was awed by history but never shirked its burdens. The book was a massive bestseller. It landed on the New York Times list and stayed there for weeks, selling in enormous quantities. It was a critical and commercial triumph. It perfectly met the national mood, providing an intimate human portrait of the very type of leader America now craved. Margaret had done more than write a book. She had taken control of her father's legacy, ensuring that his voice and his humanity would be central to how he was remembered. She had found her voice, not in singing, but in writing. She had in effect become the chief guardian of the Truman legacy, a role she would embrace for the rest of her life. She followed this triumph with Women of Courage, a collection of profiles of inspiring American women. Then, in 1986, she published her most difficult and perhaps most personal work, Bess W. Truman. This was a far more challenging task. Her father had been a prolific letter writer and a public man. Her mother, Bess, was pathologically private. She was the most silent First Lady of the 20th century, giving only one press conference in her husband's entire presidency. Bess had a burn basket by her desk, and she meticulously destroyed hundreds of her own letters, determined to keep her private life private. For Margaret, writing this biography was an act of historical and personal archaeology. She had to reconstruct her mother's life from the few letters that remained, from the diaries of others, from the interviews with the small handful of surviving friends, and from her own deep-seated memories. The result was a tender, revealing, and critically important biography. It gave a voice and a rich inner life to the woman who had been her father's quiet, steel-spined anchor. It was another bestseller. She edited collections of her father's letters and personal writings. She served for decades as the secretary of the Harry S. Truman Scholarship Foundation and on the board of the Truman Library in Independence. She had become a serious, respected historian and biographer. She had a dignified, prestigious, and successful third act. And then she did something no one saw coming. In 1980, she tried something new. She wrote a murder mystery. It wasn't just any mystery. It was called Murder in the White House. The concept was an act of pure commercial genius. She would use her unparalleled exclusive access, her childhood memories, to write a whodunit set inside the most secure, most famous, and most private building on Earth. Anyone could write a political thriller, but only Margaret Truman could describe the In the White House at 3 a.m. Only she knew the layout of the private residence, the hidden corridors, The specific protocol for a state dinner, the complex, often fraught relationship between the first family and the household staff. She knew where the skeletons were, literally and figuratively. The novel, which centered on the murder of a philandering Secretary of State in the Lincoln sitting room, was an explosive instant bestseller. It was a sensation. Readers weren't just getting a mystery, they were getting a private, guided tour of the White House from the only person who had ever lived there and was willing to talk. She had struck gold. She and her publishers immediately recognized that she hadn't just written a book, she had created a brand. Thus began the Capital Crimes series. For the next 28 years, a new Margaret Truman mystery became an annual publishing event. The formula was set, and it was brilliant. Each book would take readers inside a different, powerful Washington institution. Murder on Capitol Hill, murder in the Supreme Court, murder at the FBI, murder in the CIA, murder at the Pentagon, murder at the National Cathedral. Each book was a compelling guided tour. She would wrap a comfortable page-turning mystery around a core of authentic, insider detail. Her readers, mostly of her own generation, felt like they were being let in on secrets. She would describe the private elevators used by senators, the social hierarchy of a Supreme Court dinner party, the protocol for checking a weapon at FBI headquarters. This was the secret sauce that no other author could replicate. She became one of the most successful and wealthiest mystery authors in the world. She had found the one stage where her name was not a liability, not a double-edged sword, but her single greatest asset. She had at last found a way to perfectly monetize her unique, one-of-a-kind life. This third act, this literary empire, was by any commercial measure the most successful of her long and varied public life. This new identity as a best-selling author was the capstone of her public success, a brilliant and final monetization of her unique legacy. But this public commercial life ran parallel to a fourth, private one, a life of domesticity, quiet loyalty, and guarded privacy. And it was in this carefully protected private sphere, far from the glare of the bestseller lists and Washington power corridors, that she would face her life's most profound and devastating test. The private bedrock Margaret had so carefully built, her 44-year marriage to Clifton Daniel, and the 4 sons she shielded from the public, was anchored by a quiet dignity and fierce loyalty. But that foundation, in the end, would face an almost unimaginable tragedy. Together, they raised their 4 sons, Clifton Truman, William Wallace, Harrison Gates, and Thomas Washington, with a deliberate and protective privacy. Margaret, who had spent her entire youth as a public possession, a senator's daughter, and then the first daughter, was fiercely determined to give her children the one thing she never had, a normal childhood. They were not paraded in front of cameras, not used as political props. They were raised in New York City, not as presidential grandchildren, but as the sons of a journalist and a writer. This privacy was perhaps one of her life's greatest achievements. Alongside her role as a wife and mother, she was the chief guardian of her family's legacy. This was a private passion that had a public face. She served for decades as the secretary of the Harry S. Truman Scholarship Foundation and on the board of the Truman Library in Independence. This was not a ceremonial role, it was a working job. She was the living link to a presidency, the final authority on her father's history and her mother's life. She shaped the historical memory of her parents for generations to come, not just with her best-selling biographies, but with the steady, quiet work of legacy preservation. Her life, by the late 1990s, had settled into a successful, dignified rhythm. She was a beloved public figure, a matriarch, a grandmother to five, and one of the most commercially successful authors in the world. She had, by any measure, successfully navigated the treacherous waters of her birthright. And then came the year 2000. It was a year that would bring a double tragedy so profound, so cruel, that it's difficult to comprehend. On February 21st, 2000, her husband, Clifton Daniel, died at their home on Park Avenue in New York. He was 87. His death, while a deep and painful loss, was part of the natural order of things he had suffered from complications of a stroke and had lived a long, full, and distinguished life. She had been by his side. She was 75 years old, a widow, a mother of 4 grown men, and a grandmother. She began the difficult, painful process of grieving, of adjusting to a life without the man who had been her partner, her anchor, and her confidant for nearly half a century. And then, just as she was finding her footing in this new, sad reality, the unthinkable happened. 7 months later, on the night of September 4th, 2000, her second son, William Wallace Daniel, was in Manhattan. William, 41 years old, was the embodiment of the privacy Margaret had fought so hard to give her children. He was not a public figure. He was described as a social worker, a man who, much like his grandmother Bess, had actively avoided the limelight. He was a psychiatric social worker with the New York City Department of Health and Mental Hygiene. He was, by all accounts, a quiet, gentle man dedicated to helping others. He was walking near his apartment on the Upper East Side when he was struck by a taxi. He was killed instantly. It is a tragedy that is almost Greek in its cruelty, to lose your husband and your child in the same year. One lost to time and age, the other to a random, senseless, brutal stroke of fate. The pain of burying a child is an agony for which there is no preparation, no shield. To endure it while still in the fresh mourning for one's life partner is a trial beyond words. This was the private wound that Margaret Truman carried. She, who had lived her entire life under the relentless gaze of the public, now had to endure the most private of all agonies. She had faced down music critics, political scandals, and the intense pressures of a life she never asked for. But this was a different and infinitely more terrible kind of trial. She absorbed the blow with the same stoic Midwestern dignity that had defined her mother. She did not break. She did not crumble in public. There were no televised interviews, no public displays of grief. She retreated into the privacy of her family, the very privacy she had so carefully cultivated. She continued her work. She continued to write. Her Capital Crimes series continued to be published, and she continued to guard her family's legacy. It is impossible to look at her story without seeing this fault line of immense, almost unbearable personal suffering. It is the fragile human heart of her story, a reminder that the lives we see on the public stage, the glamorous singers, the witty TV hosts, the best-selling authors, are only a fraction of the battles fought behind the curtain. Her greatest strength, it turned out, was not her voice or her poise or her name. It was her resilience. This quiet, stoic resilience defined her character in the face of immense personal tragedy. But her public life, lived so openly for so long, invited more than just sympathy. It invited scrutiny and debate. Her fame was a double-edged sword that cut both ways. From the very beginning of her career to its lucrative end, her name and her work were at the center of 2 major defining controversies that would complicate her legacy. As with any life lived so publicly, Margaret Truman's story is not without its complex arguments and sharp-edged controversies. Her 83-year journey was defined by her unique name, and that name was at the center of the 2 great debates that bookend her career: the Paul Hume incident, which we discussed earlier, is the story everyone remembers, the one anecdote that has calcified in public memory, often eclipsing her decades of other work. But now, with the passage of time, the question remains, who was right? On one side, you have Paul Hume. His job was not to be polite, it was to be a critic. By all accounts, including those of other critics who reviewed her performances, his assessment was harsh but fundamentally accurate. Margaret Truman was a pleasant singer. She had a fair voice. She was, as Hume pointed out, flat a good deal of the time. She was not a world-class, technically perfect coloratura soprano. She was not, and was never going to be, Maria Callas or Joan Sutherland. Hume was doing his job. He was reviewing a professional ticketed performance at Constitution Hall, not a high school recital. To treat her with kid gloves because she was the president's daughter would have been a different kind of journalistic malpractice. On the other side, you have President Harry S. Truman. His letter was volatile, unpresidential, and a clear physical threat against a private citizen. It was, in many ways, an appalling abuse of his office. The press, particularly the opposition press, had a field day, painting him as a thin-skinned, unstable leader whose judgment couldn't be trusted. And yet the public reaction was fascinatingly split. While the Washington elite and the press corps were horrified, thousands of letters poured into the White House, the vast majority of them in support of the president. They were from fathers, from veterans, from ordinary people who saw not an abuse of power, but the raw, relatable, and deeply human act of a father defending his daughter. It remains one of the most defining and, for many, endearing stories about him. It was give 'em hell Harry in his purest, most loyal form, and then caught in the middle was Margaret. She was the one who paid the highest price. The incident forever defined her singing career. It didn't matter how hard she had trained with Helen Traubel, how many concerts she had performed, or that she had sung at Carnegie Hall. The scandal painted her as a rank amateur, a dilettante who was only on stage because of her name, and who was so fragile she had to be protected by her father's temper. It was profoundly unfair, but it was the inescapable reality of her position. She had wanted to be judged on her own merits, and this incident, ironically, made that an impossibility. The second controversy is quieter, but in many ways more significant, and it concerns her third act, the capital crimes novels. For decades, as the multi-million-dollar series flew off the shelves, there were whispers in the publishing world. The prose was competent, but perhaps too competent, too formulaic. The books were well-structured, the plots were serviceable, but they lacked a unique literary voice. And then there was the sheer, relentless volume, a new thick novel every single year, like clockwork, arriving alongside her serious nonfiction work. This was a prodigious output for any author, let alone one in her 60s and 70s, who also maintained a busy public schedule. The whispers were simple. She wasn't writing them. The whispers were confirmed after her death. A professional writer named Donald Bain, a prolific author who was most famous for ghostwriting The Popular Murder, she wrote novel series, acknowledged the truth. In 2014, 6 years after Margaret's death, Bain admitted in an interview with Publishers Weekly that he had in fact written 27 novels in the Margaret Truman capital crime series. He called her a close collaborator. The process, he explained, was a well-oiled machine. Margaret would provide the core concept. She would choose the Washington location, the Supreme Court, the FBI, the Pentagon, and most crucially, she would provide the insider anecdotes, the authentic details, the secret sauce that gave the books their unique flavor and their primary selling point. She would, Bain said, review his outlines and drafts, making suggestions and adding her own memories. But the writing, the prose, The plot, the 80,000 words of scaffolding that held it all together, that was Donald Bain. To complicate matters, another ghostwriter, William Harrington, had made a similar claim years earlier. Harrington, who also ghostwrote for other high-profile figures, claimed in a note found before his suicide in 2000 that he too had been a ghostwriter for Truman, specifically on her earlier novels, including the first blockbuster Murder in the White House. So, was Margaret Truman a fraud? Or was she, as Donald Bain suggested, a producer, the creative director of a brand that bore her name? In the world of celebrity publishing, this arrangement is incredibly common. She was the author in the same way that James Patterson is the author of his dozens of co-written books, or the way Tom Clancy was the author of the Op Center series. She was the brand. She wasn't the one typing every word, but she was the visionary, the source of the material that made the product unique. This controversy, just like the Paul Hume incident, revolves around her name. In the first, her name was a liability, a magnet for criticism that overshadowed her actual, if limited, talent. In the second, her name and the exclusive access it represented was her single greatest asset, a commodity to be packaged, marketed, and sold. It certainly complicates her legacy as a writer, but it doesn't change the fact that she was the brilliant architect of a multi-million-dollar empire. She had, in her third act, finally figured out the puzzle of her life. She had been given this strange, unique, one-of-a-kind life, this childhood spent in the corridors of power. For years, she had tried to run from it, to build a career in spite of it. With the Capital Crimes series, she finally did the opposite. She turned around, embraced it, and sold it. She had found the one stage where her name was not a liability, but the entire point. These two controversies, one about her talent, the other about her authenticity, were, in essence, both debates about her name and her right to the spotlight. But a life cannot be reduced to its scandals. To truly understand her legacy, we must look beyond the individual incidents and see the complete picture, the full 83-year journey of a woman who was handed a legacy but through 3 distinct public acts chose to build her own. So how do we, in the end, remember Margaret Truman? Her life, which spanned 83 years, left an echo that is far more significant and complex than many realize. It's a story that unfolded in 3 distinct acts, each on a national stage, each defined by a different ambition. But beneath the public-facing careers, her life was a constant private negotiation with the one thing she could never escape: her name. She was born a Truman, and her entire life was a journey of figuring out what that meant, what it gave her, what it cost her, and what she could build from it. Her legacy, therefore, is not a single accomplishment but a triptych, a 3-part answer to the question of her identity. Her first and most immediate legacy was in redefining the role of a first daughter. Before Margaret, presidential daughters were largely seen, not heard. They were either demure, silent figures who served as White House hostesses, like the daughters of Woodrow Wilson, or they were rebellious. Headline-grabbing personalities like Alice Roosevelt, who famously said she could either be president or throw bombs, but neither was a professional, neither had a career. Margaret was the first modern one. She was ambitious, she was public. She had her own career, her own contract, and her own payroll. She was not just a socialite, she was an artist and a broadcaster. She took the platform she was given and, instead of just standing on it, she used it as a launch pad. When she sang at Carnegie Hall, it was a professional engagement. When she co-hosted a radio show with Mike Wallace or sat on the panel of What's My Line, she was a paid media personality. She was, in short, the first daughter to attempt to build a public brand separate from her father's, even as it was inescapably enabled by it. She endured public scandals, not just for her social behavior, but for her professional work. She set a new mold, a precursor to the public-facing, career-driven presidential children who would follow. She proved that a president's child could be a protagonist in their own right, not just a supporting character in someone else's story. Second, and perhaps most importantly to her, she was the chief architect of her parents' post-presidential legacy. This was her most serious and arguably her most enduring work. Her biographies of Harry and Bess Truman were not just loving memoirs, they were foundational historical works. When her father's biography was published in 1973, it was a cultural event. The nation was mired in the cynicism of the Watergate scandal, watching a presidency consumed by paranoia and dirty tricks. Into that void, Margaret published an intimate, deeply human portrait of a different kind of leader, a man of integrity, a plain-spoken man from Missouri, whose defining trait was his unwillingness to pass the buck. The book was a massive bestseller precisely because it offered a nostalgic, inspiring alternative to the political climate of the day. It was a masterful act of historical timing, and it played a crucial role in cementing the Truman rehabilitation, ensuring that her father, who left office with dismal approval ratings, would be remembered as he wished. Complex, human, decisive, and above all, the people's president. Her biography of her mother, Bess, was an even more difficult feat. It gave voice and substance to one of the 20th century's most intentionally private public figures, rescuing her from the historical footnote of being the silent First Lady. Margaret was, in effect, the guardian of the flame. She did not just protect her parents' memory, she actively shaped it, ensuring that their story was told with a warmth, detail, and authority that no other historian could ever match. Her decades of work with the Truman Library and the Truman Scholarship Foundation were not vanity projects. They were the hands-on labor of a woman who understood that legacy is not just inherited, but built. And finally, there is the legacy of her third act. Her capital crimes series, regardless of its authorship, remains a fascinating cultural artifact. This was the perfect fusion of her entire life. It was the perfect fusion of her two worlds, the high-minded, serious, and secretive world of Washington power and the commercial, celebrity-driven world of popular, accessible entertainment. For decades, she had struggled with her name. In her singing career, it was a liability, a magnet for critics. In her television career, it was an asset, a get for producers. But in her literary career, she finally figured out the puzzle. She turned her name, and the exclusive access and insider knowledge it implied, into a multi-million-dollar product, a brand. She took the unique circumstances of her birth, the gilded cage she had grown up in, and instead of being crushed by it, she turned it into a commodity. It was the ultimate, undeniable success, all on her own terms. Margaret Truman. Daniel died on January 29, 2008 in Chicago, near where her son Clifton lived. She was 83 years old. She had been ill for several weeks, suffering from complications of an infection, and had been on a respirator. Her death was a quiet end to a very loud life. Her life had begun in the quiet modesty of Independence, Missouri. It had taken her to the global stage, to the White House, to Carnegie Hall, to the television studios of New York, and to the top of the bestseller lists. And in the end, it took her home. Her ashes, along with those of her husband Clifton, were interred in the one place that was most fitting, in the sun-dappled courtyard of her father's presidential library, back in Independence, alongside Harry and Bess. The girl who had christened the USS Missouri, who had been protected by a president's rage, and who had raised a family of her own, was, in the end, Home Margaret's story is ultimately one of a search for identity. She was given a name that was both a golden key and a heavy, crushing burden. She was told by the world's most powerful man that she was perfect, and by the world's most powerful critics that she was a failure. She could have faded. She could have become a bitter footnote, a society hostess, or a punchline. Instead, she refused to be defined by any one thing. She was a testament to resilience. When her first dream, the opera, was shattered by a brutal review and a father's suffocating love, she built a new one in television. And when that life gave way to family and a return to the past, she built a third one as an author and a historian. But her life is also a deeply poignant story of love and loss. It is a reminder that no amount of fame, power, or history can shield a human heart from breaking her story. It is defined by the love of a father so fierce it became a national incident. It is defined by the steady, quiet love for a husband of 44 years, her partner and her anchor. And it is defined by the devastating private grief for a son, a loss that reminds us that the lives we see on the public stage are only a fraction of the battles fought behind the curtain. She was not just the president's daughter. That was her circumstance, not her identity. She was a singer, a host, a writer, a historian, a wife, and a grieving mother. She was a woman who lived her entire life in the brightest, hottest spotlight imaginable, and somehow, through it all, managed to write her own script.